The first German shells hit Moscow's outer defenses on November 20th, 1941. General Heinz Guderian stood in the turret of his command vehicle, watching the spires of the Kremlin shimmer through his field glasses. He could see them. After 5 months of the most successful military campaign in human history, after crushing Poland in weeks and France in 40 days, after encircling entire Soviet armies and capturing millions, he could finally see Moscow. The war was over. Except it wasn't. And what happened in the next 6 weeks would break the Wehrmacht so completely that some German officers would later say the war was lost right there in the frozen mud outside Stalin's capital, long before Stalingrad, long before Normandy. This is the story of how absolute certainty became absolute catastrophe. September 1941. The mood inside German high command wasn't just confident. It was euphoric. General Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff, wrote in his diary that the Soviet Union was finished, that Stalin's regime would collapse within weeks. Officers were already discussing occupation zones and what they'd do after the victory parades in Red Square. They had reason for that confidence. Operation Barbarossa had been the most devastating military offensive ever launched. 3 million German soldiers had crossed the Soviet border on June 22nd. Within days, entire Soviet armies ceased to exist. The Luftwaffe destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft, most of them on the ground. German panzer divisions drove hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, encircling massive formations of Red Army troops who had no idea how to fight this kind of war. The Germans called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. It relied on speed, concentration, and the absolute integration of armor, infantry, and air power. Panzer divisions would punch through enemy lines, drive deep into the rear, and encircle entire armies before they could retreat. Then the infantry would march up and finish the job while the panzers raced forward again. It had worked in Poland, it had worked in France, and for 5 months it worked in Russia. By September, German forces had killed or captured over 2 million Soviet soldiers. They'd seized most of Ukraine, surrounded Leningrad, and stood within striking distance of Moscow. The statistics were staggering. In a single encirclement at Kiev, the Germans captured 600,000 Soviet troops. 600,000. Entire field armies just vanished from the Soviet order of battle. Hitler was so confident that he ordered winter clothing production scaled back. The troops wouldn't need it. They'd be in Moscow before the snow fell, and the war would be over. German logistics officers began planning for occupation duty, not winter combat. This wasn't arrogance. This was the calculated assessment of professional soldiers who'd just executed the most successful campaign in military history. They'd studied the numbers. They'd seen the intelligence reports. The Red Army was broken. Stalin's purges of the officer corps in the late 1930s had left Soviet forces led by political commissars and terrified survivors who knew that failure meant execution. The Germans had better training, better equipment, better leadership, and an unbroken string of victories. How could they lose? But there were signs, small things that didn't fit the pattern. Soviet soldiers who should have surrendered kept fighting. Units that were encircled and doomed held their positions until they were completely destroyed. German officers noted it in their reports, but couldn't quite process what it meant. They'd never seen anything like it. In France, when a position became hopeless, French officers surrendered. It was the rational thing to do. Why die for nothing? But Soviet soldiers didn't surrender, even when surrender was the only logical choice. Machine gun crews stayed at their guns until German tanks ran them over. Anti-tank teams held their fire until panzers were 10 meters away, ensuring they'd get one kill before they died. It wasn't bravery in the way the Germans understood bravery. It was something else. Something harder and colder and more absolute. General Guderian commanded the 2nd Panzer Army, one of the most powerful formations in the Wehrmacht. He was a brilliant tactician, a pioneer of armored warfare, and one of the architects of Blitzkrieg. In early October, his tanks were pushing toward Tula, the last major city between his forces and Moscow. He expected to break through within days. Then the weather changed. The autumn rains came. Not the gentle rains of Germany, but massive, relentless downpours that turned the Russian roads into rivers of mud. The Germans called it Rasputitsa, the time without roads. Tanks bogged down. Supply trucks couldn't move. Entire divisions ground to a halt, stuck in mud so deep that vehicles sank to their axles. Guderian's staff officers assured him it was temporary. The mud would freeze, the advance would resume, and they'd be in Moscow before Christmas. But the delay cost them weeks, precious weeks. And while the Germans sat motionless in the mud, something was happening behind Soviet lines. Stalin was bringing in reinforcements, fresh divisions from Siberia and the Far East. Troops who knew how to fight in winter, who had proper equipment, and weren't traumatized by 5 months of catastrophic defeat. German intelligence knew the reinforcements were coming. They just didn't believe it mattered. The Red Army had already lost millions of men. A few more divisions wouldn't change the outcome. This was the fundamental miscalculation. The Germans thought they were fighting the Soviet Union the way they'd fought France. But France had a breaking point. The Soviet Union didn't. Or rather, Stalin didn't. He would feed men into the meat grinder until the grinder broke. And German generals, for all their brilliance, couldn't quite grasp that. By November, the mud had frozen. Guderian's panzers started moving again. They were behind schedule, undersupplied, and exhausted, but they were moving. On November 15th, the Wehrmacht launched the final push toward Moscow. Hitler called it Operation Typhoon. The plan was simple and brutal. Concentrate overwhelming force, break through the Soviet defenses, and seize the capital before winter truly set in. For the first few days, it worked. German forces punched through Soviet lines and drove toward Moscow's outskirts. Reconnaissance units reported they could see the spires of the Kremlin. Victory was measured in kilometers now, not in hundreds of miles. Just a little farther, just a few more days. Then the temperature dropped. Not gradually, not the slow cooling of a normal autumn. It plunged, -20, -30, -40 degrees Celsius, colder than anything the German troops had experienced, colder than anything they were equipped for. The Wehrmacht had conquered most of Europe in summer uniforms and light jackets. Now they were fighting in conditions that made the metal of their rifles too cold to touch with bare hands. Engine oil turned to sludge. Vehicles wouldn't start. Machine guns froze solid. Frostbite became a bigger killer than Soviet bullets. Men wrapped themselves in blankets and newspaper, trying desperately to stay warm. They burned furniture from abandoned houses. They huddled in shallow dugouts that provided no real shelter from the wind that cut through everything. And the Soviets counterattacked, not with the disorganized, panicked attacks of the summer. These were planned, coordinated offensives by fresh troops who had winter uniforms and equipment designed for the cold. Siberian divisions hit the exhausted, frozen German units with a ferocity that shocked even veteran Wehrmacht officers. Soviet ski troops appeared out of nowhere, moving through snow that German soldiers could barely walk through. T-34 tanks with wide tracks designed for mud and snow smashed into German positions. The tables had turned. Suddenly, it was the Germans who were surrounded. Suddenly, it was German commanders screaming for reinforcements that didn't exist. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. General Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army was falling apart, not from a single catastrophic defeat, but from the grinding, relentless erosion of combat effectiveness. His tanks were out of fuel. His men were freezing. His supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles through territory that was now crawling with Soviet partisans. On December 5th, 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive. Over 1 million Soviet troops, supported by thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, hit the overstretched German lines. The Wehrmacht had no reserves, no winter positions, no fallback plan, because they weren't supposed to need one. The war was supposed to be over. Hitler had said so. The High Command had believed it. And now, German soldiers were paying the price for that belief. The retreat was chaos. Units fell back in disorder, abandoning equipment they couldn't move. German commanders who'd spent 5 months perfecting the art of encirclement now found themselves on the other side of that equation, desperately trying to prevent their forces from being cut off and destroyed. Wehrmacht officers who'd never experienced defeat suddenly had to make decisions they'd never trained for. How do you conduct a fighting retreat in -40-degree weather when half your men have frostbite and your vehicles won't start? Some units maintained discipline, others disintegrated. By December 20th, German forces had been pushed back between 100 and 200 kilometers from Moscow. The offensive was over. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility was over. And the war that was supposed to end in 6 months had just become a war of attrition that Germany couldn't win. Here's what made it worse. The German generals knew it. General Halder, who'd written in his diary just months earlier that the Soviet Union was finished, now wrote that the Wehrmacht faced catastrophe. Field Marshal von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, reported that his forces were on the verge of collapse. Guderian sent increasingly desperate reports to High Command, begging for permission to retreat to defensible positions before his entire army was destroyed. Hitler's response was simple: no retreat, not one step back. Fight where you stand or be relieved of command. And in a twisted way, Hitler was right. If the Wehrmacht retreated, it might not stop retreating until it was back in Poland. The only thing holding the front together was sheer willpower and the knowledge that falling back might mean complete disintegration. But holding the line meant dying. German soldiers, who'd conquered most of Europe in a matter of months, now dug shallow holes in frozen ground and waited for Soviet attacks they couldn't repel. Entire companies were wiped out defending positions that had no strategic value simply because they'd been ordered not to retreat. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties in some units. Men lost fingers and toes and feet to the cold. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. The wounded often died not from their injuries, but from exposure during transport. The logistics system, which had barely managed to keep up during the advance, completely broke down during the winter fighting. Supply convoys were ambushed by partisans. Rail lines were sabotaged. What little food and ammunition got through went to the units in the most desperate situations, which meant most units got almost nothing. The human cost was staggering. In the first 3 weeks of December, Army Group Center lost over 100,000 men. Not killed, lost, killed, wounded, missing, captured, incapacitated by frostbite and disease. These were irreplaceable losses. Veteran infantrymen and tank crews and artillery spotters who'd fought from Poland to the gates of Moscow. You couldn't replace them with raw recruits from Germany. This was specialized knowledge being bled away in a frozen wasteland. And for what? By Christmas 1941, it was clear that the Wehrmacht wasn't going to take Moscow. It was clear that the Soviet Union wasn't going to collapse. It was clear that this war would continue, and every professional officer in the German military knew what that meant. Germany couldn't win a long war. The Reich didn't have the population or the industrial capacity to match the combined might of the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States, which had just entered the war after Pearl Harbor. Blitzkrieg worked because it was quick. You hit hard, you won fast, and you moved on before the enemy could mobilize their full strength. But there would be no quick victory in Russia. The window had closed. Stalin had survived the initial onslaught, and now he had time. Time to build more tanks, time to train more soldiers, time to move factories beyond the Ural Mountains where German bombers couldn't reach them, time to grind the Wehrmacht down through sheer attrition. The mathematics were brutal and unavoidable. Germany was doomed. German generals knew it. Some of them said it out loud in private conversations that could have gotten them shot, but they kept fighting because stopping meant accepting defeat. And the German military culture couldn't process that, because Hitler would execute anyone who suggested surrender, because retreat might mean Soviet forces pouring into Germany, and they'd all heard the stories about what happened in territories the Red Army recaptured. So they fought through that first terrible winter, and then through the next year, and the year after that. Stalingrad, Kursk, the slow, grinding retreat westward, every battle more desperate than the last, every casualty harder to replace. The Wehrmacht would win tactical victories. It would kill millions more Soviet soldiers. It would demonstrate time and again that German troops were among the finest fighting men the world had ever seen. None of it mattered. The war was lost outside Moscow in December 1941. Everything that came after was just the long, bloody aftermath. The psychological impact on German commanders was profound. These were men who'd built their careers on the idea that superior training and tactics could overcome any numerical disadvantage. They'd proven it in battle after battle. But Russia broke that formula. You could execute a perfect encirclement, destroy 3 Soviet armies, and 2 weeks later, there'd be 4 new armies in their place. You could achieve kill ratios of 5-1, 10-1, and still lose because the enemy had inexhaustible reserves. It was like fighting the ocean. Every wave you broke just meant another wave was coming. German officers started showing signs of strain that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Combat fatigue, nervous breakdowns, a quiet desperation that crept into official reports. The rank and file soldiers felt it too. The letters they sent home changed in tone. In the early months of Barbarossa, German soldiers wrote about adventure and victory and the exotic Russian landscape. By winter, the letters were darker. They wrote about cold and hunger and friends who didn't make it. Some letters were never sent because the men who wrote them froze to death before supply trucks could collect the mail. Chaplains reported that men who'd never been religious suddenly wanted to talk about God and meaning and whether any of this had purpose. The certainty that had propelled the Wehrmacht across Europe was gone, replaced by a grim determination to survive one more day, one more week, one more winter. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. Soviet casualties were even worse, far worse, The Red Army lost millions of men in 1941 and 42. Entire generations of young Soviet men were wiped out. Divisions were destroyed, reformed, and destroyed again. The industrial cities that Stalin moved beyond the Urals operated on near-slave labor, with workers collapsing from exhaustion at their machines. The civilian death toll from starvation and exposure and German occupation was almost incomprehensible. This wasn't a war fought by professional armies on distant battlefields. This was total war, societal suicide on both sides. The difference was that Stalin could afford it and Hitler couldn't. The Soviet Union had the population and the territory and the resources to take catastrophic losses and keep fighting. Germany didn't. The German generals understood this on an intellectual level, but emotionally, they couldn't accept it. They'd been raised in a military tradition that prized excellence and efficiency. The idea that those qualities could be overcome by sheer mass, by throwing enough bodies at the problem until it was solved, offended them at a fundamental level. It seemed wasteful, barbaric, un-German. They kept looking for the decisive battle, the brilliant maneuver that would break Soviet morale and force a negotiated peace. They kept believing that if they just fought hard enough, smart enough, the tide would turn. It never did. The Eastern Front consumed everything Germany fed into it and demanded more. Divisions that had conquered France were ground down to understrength battle groups. Elite SS units that were supposed to be the tip of the spear became desperate rearguard formations trying to prevent encirclements. By the summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht tried one more offensive, Operation Blue, the drive toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. It started well. German forces broke through Soviet lines and drove deep into southern Russia. For a few months, it looked like Blitzkrieg might work one more time. Then Stalingrad happened. The Sixth Army, over 200,000 German soldiers, got trapped in the ruins of a city they'd mostly destroyed. Soviet forces encircled them in November. Hitler ordered them to fight to the last man. They did. The Sixth Army was annihilated. Field Marshal Paulus surrendered the remnants in February 1943. It was the first time an entire German field army had surrendered. The psychological impact was enormous. After Stalingrad, there was no more talk of victory. The best the Wehrmacht could hope for was a stalemate. Some kind of negotiated peace that would leave Germany in control of conquered territories in the West while giving up the endless meat grinder in the East. But the Allies demanded unconditional surrender. There would be no negotiation, no way out except through. So German soldiers kept fighting, kept dying, kept retreating westward. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 was supposed to be the counteroffensive that would stabilize the Eastern Front. It was the largest tank battle in history. The Germans lost. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht never launched another major offensive in the East. It was all retreat all the time, fighting, delaying actions, trying to buy time for evacuations, burning everything as they fell back so the Soviets couldn't use it. The generals who'd trusted in Blitzkrieg were mostly dead or disgraced by this point. Some had been killed in action. Some had been fired by Hitler for requesting permission to retreat. A few had been executed after the July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt. The officers who remained were harder men, realists who knew the war was lost but kept fighting anyway because the alternative was watching the Red Army roll into Berlin unopposed. They fought skillful defensive battles. They extracted their forces from encirclements that should have been death traps. They demonstrated repeatedly that the German military, even in defeat, was extraordinarily dangerous. None of it changed the outcome. What's remarkable is how long it took. From December 1941, when the tide turned outside Moscow, to May 1945, when Berlin fell. 3.5 years of fighting after the war was effectively lost. 3.5 years of casualties and destruction and suffering that served no strategic purpose. The Wehrmacht killed millions more Soviet soldiers during that period. The Luftwaffe kept flying, even as Allied bombers turned German cities into rubble. U-boats kept sinking Allied shipping, even though the Battle of the Atlantic was lost. German soldiers fought with skill and courage and determination that would have been admirable in any other context. But they were fighting for a regime that had doomed them through ideological blindness and strategic incompetence. The veterans who survived carried psychological scars that never healed. German soldiers who'd fought on the Eastern Front rarely talked about it, even decades later. When they did, they spoke about the cold, the endless cold, the way it got into your bones and never left. They spoke about friends who'd frozen to death in their sleep, about orders that made no sense but had to be followed, about the slow realization that they were going to lose and there was nothing they could do about it. Some became bitter, others retreated into silence. A few wrote memoirs that tried to make sense of it all, to find meaning in the meaningless. Most just wanted to forget. The Soviet veterans had their own trauma. They'd won, but the cost was almost unimaginable. Over 25 million Soviet citizens died during the war. Entire regions were depopulated. Cities were obliterated. The psychological impact of that level of loss rippled through Soviet society for generations. Victory parades and medals couldn't erase the memory of what it had taken to achieve that victory. Stalin's propaganda machine tried to shape the narrative, to turn the Great Patriotic War into a story of heroic triumph. But the men who'd actually fought it knew better. They knew how close it had been, how many times the front had nearly collapsed, how much of their success came from sheer desperation rather than military genius. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The professional military analysis of what went wrong for Germany fills libraries. Historians have identified dozens of factors: Hitler's interference in operational decisions, the failure to prioritize Moscow over economic targets in Ukraine, the underestimation of Soviet industrial capacity, the logistics nightmare of supplying armies hundreds of miles from German railheads, the impact of Lend-Lease aid from the United States, the resistance of Soviet civilians, the effectiveness of partisan warfare, the quality of Soviet weapons like the T-34 tank and Katyusha rocket launcher, the brilliance of Soviet commanders like Zhukov and Rokossovsky once they learned how to fight the Germans. All of these factors mattered, but they all came back to one fundamental miscalculation. The Germans thought they could win quickly. They built an entire military strategy around the idea of quick, decisive victory. When that didn't happen, they had no backup plan. The Wehrmacht wasn't designed for a long war of attrition. It didn't have the reserves, or the industrial base, or the strategic depth. Blitzkrieg was brilliant, but it was also brittle. It worked perfectly when everything went according to plan. But when the plan failed, when the enemy refused to collapse on schedule, the whole system started to fall apart. And once it started falling apart, there was no way to put it back together. The retreat from Moscow wasn't just a tactical setback. It was proof that the fundamental assumptions underlying German strategy were wrong. Some German officers understood this immediately. Others took years to accept it. A few never did. They kept believing that if circumstances had been slightly different, if the weather had held for another 2 weeks, if Hitler had made different decisions, victory would have been possible. Maybe they're right. History is full of might-have-beens, but what actually happened is clear. The Wehrmacht reached the gates of Moscow in December 1941, with exhausted troops, frozen equipment, and overextended supply lines. The Red Army counterattacked with fresh divisions, winter gear, and the knowledge that retreat meant execution. The Germans were driven back. The myth of invincibility shattered, and everything that followed was just the slow working out of consequences that became inevitable in those frozen weeks outside Stalin's capital. The human dimension is what stays with you. The individual soldiers on both sides who found themselves caught up in something far larger than they could comprehend. The German private who joined up in 1939 expecting a quick war and maybe some adventure, now huddled in a frozen foxhole wondering if he'd ever see home again. The Soviet conscript torn from his village, handed a rifle, and told to hold a position against tanks. The decisions they had to make, the things they saw, the friends they lost. War reduces everything to immediate, brutal simplicity. Stay alive. Keep your buddies alive. Follow orders. Don't think too much about the bigger picture, because the bigger picture is overwhelming, and you can't affect it anyway. But the bigger picture shaped everything. Grand strategy and logistics and industrial production and political decisions made by men who'd never seen combat determined whether individual soldiers lived or died. The German soldier freezing outside Moscow was there because Hitler had decided to invade the Soviet Union without securing his western flank, without adequate preparation for winter warfare, without a realistic assessment of what would be required. The Soviet soldier defending Moscow was there because Stalin had purged his officer corps, signed a pact with Hitler that bought time but guaranteed eventual war, and then was caught completely off guard by the German invasion. The generals on both sides made countless decisions that cascaded down through the chain of command until they became orders that individual soldiers had to execute or die trying. Some of those decisions were brilliant. Some were catastrophically stupid. Most fell somewhere in between. What's clear is that by December 1941, the cumulative weight of German mistakes had created a situation where victory was no longer possible. The Wehrmacht could still fight. It could still kill enormous numbers of enemy soldiers. It could still conduct operationally brilliant maneuvers, but it couldn't win. The math didn't work anymore, and recognizing that fact, accepting it, required a level of intellectual honesty that was almost impossible for men who'd built their entire identities around military excellence and victory. So they kept fighting, kept hoping, kept believing that somehow, some way, they'd find a path to victory that didn't exist. The frozen ground outside Moscow soaked up blood from both sides. German and Soviet soldiers killed each other over positions that would change hands 3 or 4 times in a single day. Artillery churned the snow into a red-black slush. Tank battles left dozens of burning hulks scattered across the landscape. Infantry assaults dissolved into close-quarters combat with knives and entrenching tools when ammunition ran out. This was war at its most primitive and brutal. All the technological sophistication of modern militaries reduced to men killing other men at arm's length. The survivors on both sides would carry memories of those battles for the rest of their lives. Nightmares that wouldn't fade. Guilt over the ones who didn't make it. Questions about why they survived when better men died. There are no good answers to those questions. Survival in combat is random. Skill and training help, but luck matters more than anyone wants to admit. The bullet that kills one man misses the man standing next to him by inches. The shell that lands in one foxhole doesn't land in another. You can do everything right and still die. You can make mistakes and survive. The men who came home carried that knowledge with them. It made some of them fatalistic. It made others paranoid. It made most of them reluctant to talk about what they'd experienced because people who hadn't been there couldn't understand, and people who had been there didn't need to be told. The December 1941 retreat marked the end of German confidence on the Eastern Front. Oh, they'd have victories after. They'd encircle Soviet forces at Kharkov in 1942. They'd push deep into the Caucasus, but it was never the same. The certainty was gone. The swagger was gone. German soldiers learned to look over their shoulders, to worry about encirclement, to fear the Russian winter. The Red Army learned that the Germans could be beaten. That lesson was priceless. It transformed Soviet morale. Units that might have broken and run in the summer of '41 now stood and fought because they'd seen Germans retreat. They'd seen German equipment abandoned. They'd seen German prisoners beaten and frostbitten, shuffling to the rear. The invincible enemy wasn't invincible after all. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. Stalin exploited that shift ruthlessly. Soviet propaganda celebrated the Moscow counteroffensive as proof that the fascist invaders could be defeated. Newsreels showed captured German equipment. Newspapers published stories about heroic Red Army soldiers driving the enemy back. The message was clear: we can win this. It's going to cost everything we have, but we can win. And the Soviet people, who'd already suffered enormously, accepted even greater suffering because they could see a path to victory. The factories beyond the Urals increased production. More tanks, more planes, more artillery shells. Women and children worked 16-hour shifts in conditions that would have violated every labor law in peacetime. They did it because the alternative was Nazi occupation, and everyone knew what that meant. The racial ideology underlying German strategy made surrender impossible for the Soviets. This wasn't a conventional war, where defeat meant occupation and maybe some territorial concessions. Nazi ideology classified Slavs as subhuman. The plan for conquered Soviet territory involved deliberate starvation of tens of millions of people to make room for German settlers. The SS followed the Wehrmacht, conducting mass executions. Soviet civilians who survived the initial German advance lived under a regime of terror that made Stalin's purges look measured by comparison. Word of this got back to Soviet-held territory. It hardened resistance. Soviet soldiers knew that losing meant death for their families. That knowledge made them willing to accept suicidal orders. Better to die fighting than to let the Germans win. The Germans, for their part, couldn't retreat from their ideology even when it became strategically insane. There were opportunities for negotiated settlements early in the war. Anti-Stalin sentiment in Ukraine and other regions meant some Soviet citizens initially welcomed the Germans as liberators. If the Wehrmacht had treated them decently, if they'd positioned themselves as freeing people from communist tyranny, they might have gained millions of allies. Instead, Nazi racial policy treated everyone as subhuman. Villages that might have supported the Germans were burned. Civilians who might have collaborated were executed or sent to slave labor camps. The brutality guaranteed that resistance would be total. It guaranteed that the Soviet population would fight to the last because they had no alternative. This was the ultimate failure of German strategy. Not just military miscalculation, but ideological blindness so profound that it made victory impossible. You can't conquer and hold territory when the entire population is your enemy. You can't win a war of attrition when you're fighting not just an army, but an entire society mobilized for your destruction. The Wehrmacht might have been the finest fighting force in the world in 1941. It didn't matter. They were fighting a war that couldn't be won through military excellence alone. And by the time German commanders understood that, it was too late to change course. The machinery of destruction was in motion. All they could do was ride it to the bitter end. The final year of the war was a nightmare. Soviet forces pushed westward through Poland and into Germany itself. The Red Army that entered German territory in early 1945 was not the Red Army that had been shattered in 1941. These were hardened veterans who'd fought their way from Moscow to Berlin. They'd seen what the Germans had done in occupied Soviet territory. They knew about the mass graves and the burned villages and the death camps. When they entered Germany, discipline collapsed. Soviet soldiers raped and pillaged their way across East Prussia and Silesia. German civilians fled westward in one of the largest forced migrations in human history. Millions died from exposure, starvation, and violence. The Wehrmacht tried to hold the line, tried to protect German civilians from Soviet revenge. It was hopeless. The Red Army had overwhelming numerical and material superiority. German units fought fanatical defensive battles and died to buy time for civilian evacuations. Young boys and old men were pressed into service in the Volkssturm, Germany's last-ditch militia. They were given rifles and told to stop Soviet tanks. Most of them died within hours of entering combat. The professional soldiers who remained knew it was over. They fought anyway, because surrender to the Soviets meant a slave labor camp in Siberia if you were lucky, execution if you weren't. Better to die fighting or try to surrender to the Western Allies. Berlin fell in May 1945. Soviet forces raised the red flag over the Reichstag. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The cost was almost incomprehensible. Over 60 million dead worldwide. The Soviet Union alone lost 25 to 27 million people. Germany lost 7 to 8 million. Entire cities reduced to rubble. Economies destroyed. A generation of young men dead or traumatized. And for what? The Third Reich lasted 12 years. All the conquered territory was lost. Germany was occupied, divided, and wouldn't be reunified for another 45 years. Every death, every sacrifice, every frozen soldier outside Moscow, every burned village, every murdered civilian, all of it for nothing. The generals who trusted in Blitzkrieg learned the hardest possible lesson. That tactical brilliance means nothing without strategic wisdom, that you can win every battle and still lose the war. That arrogance and ideology are poor substitutes for realistic assessment of your enemy's capabilities. Some of them lived long enough to write their memoirs, trying to explain how it all went wrong. Most blamed Hitler. Some blamed the weather. A few had the honesty to admit they'd been wrong, that they'd underestimated the Soviet Union and overestimated Germany's ability to win a long war. Those admissions came too late to matter. The dead stayed dead. The cities stayed ruined. The trauma stayed embedded in the survivors. The Eastern Front became a cautionary tale. Military academies study it to this day. The importance of logistics, the danger of overextension, the limits of tactical excellence, the need to understand your enemy not as you want them to be, but as they actually are. The Wehrmacht was a superb fighting force that lost because it was led by men who couldn't adapt when their initial strategy failed. The Red Army was a blunt instrument that won through sheer mass and willingness to absorb catastrophic casualties. Neither side covered themselves in glory. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides wasted millions of lives in pursuit of objectives that seem insane in retrospect. But we remember, we have to remember, the soldiers who froze outside Moscow in December 1941. The German private who died for a cause that wasn't worth dying for. The Soviet conscript who held his position because retreat meant execution. The civilians caught between two totalitarian regimes. The sheer scale of suffering. We remember so we don't repeat it. So we understand that war is not glory and adventure, but horror and waste. So we recognize that the confidence of 1941 German generals who thought they couldn't lose was the same confidence that led to 45 million deaths. Pride before the fall. Certainty before catastrophe. Blitzkrieg before the long, terrible bleeding that followed. The snow outside Moscow still falls every winter. The ground where tens of thousands died is now farmland and forests and suburbs. The bunkers and trenches have mostly weathered away. but the memory remains. In military histories and veterans' memoirs, and the empty chairs at family gatherings where men who never came home should have been. The German generals trusted Blitzkrieg until Stalin bled the Wehrmacht dry outside Moscow. And, in those frozen weeks in December 1941, the outcome of the Second World War was decided. Everything else was just the slow, agonizing working out of consequences that became inevitable the moment the myth of German invincibility died in the Russian snow. The winter of 1941-42 became a laboratory of suffering. German soldiers learned lessons that no training manual could teach. How to keep your rifle from freezing by sleeping with it inside your coat. How to recognize the early signs of frostbite before you lost fingers. How to dig a fighting position in ground so frozen that pickaxes bounced off the surface. How to tell which buildings were structurally sound enough to provide shelter and which were death traps waiting to collapse under artillery fire. These weren't the skills of conquest. These were the skills of survival. And the fact that German soldiers had to learn them at all meant the war had already gone catastrophically wrong. The supply situation became a nightmare beyond anything the Wehrmacht had experienced. The railroad gauge in the Soviet Union was different from the European standard. German engineers had to relay thousands of miles of track while under constant partisan attack. Supply depots that should have been 50 miles behind the front were 300 miles back because the front had moved faster than the logistics system could follow. Trucks broke down from the cold faster than mechanics could repair them. Horses, the Wehrmacht's primary method of moving supplies, died by the thousands. They froze. They starved. They were worked to death hauling ammunition and rations forward and wounded men back. By January 1942, some German units were eating their horses because supply convoys couldn't get through. The Luftwaffe tried to help. Transport planes flew missions to drop supplies to isolated units. It wasn't enough. Not even close. The mathematics were brutal. A German infantry division needed roughly 500 tons of supplies per day to maintain combat effectiveness. A panzer division needed more. The Luftwaffe could deliver maybe 50 tons per day to a particular location if weather permitted, and Soviet fighters didn't shoot down the transports. The gap between what was needed and what arrived meant German units operated in a state of permanent crisis. Ammunition was rationed. Artillery batteries were limited to a handful of shells per day. Machine gunners were told to fire only when absolutely necessary. The army that had conquered most of Europe through overwhelming firepower was now fighting on a shoestring. Soviet forces faced their own supply problems, but they were closer to their railheads. Soviet trucks and tanks were designed for Russian conditions. T-34 tanks had wider tracks that distributed weight better in snow. Soviet rifles like the Mosin Nagant were simpler and more robust than German weapons, less likely to jam in the cold. Soviet soldiers wore quilted winter uniforms and felt boots that provided real protection against the cold. They weren't comfortable, but they worked. The material advantage wasn't enormous, but it was enough. When two armies are fighting in extreme conditions, small advantages compound. The side that can operate at 60% effectiveness will destroy the side that can only operate at 30% effectiveness. German commanders requested permission to retreat to defensible winter lines. Hitler refused. He'd convinced himself that retreating would trigger a rout, that German forces would flee all the way back to Poland. He was probably wrong, but he wasn't completely crazy. The Wehrmacht's retreat from Moscow was barely controlled chaos as it was. Units fell back in stages, fighting desperate rearguard actions to prevent encirclement. If Hitler had authorized a general retreat, there's a real chance it would have turned into a disaster. Better to hold in place, take heavy casualties, and maintain some kind of coherent front line. That was Hitler's reasoning. It meant German soldiers died holding worthless positions, but it probably prevented something worse. The psychological impact on German morale was profound. These were men who'd been winning for 2 years straight. Poland in weeks, France in 40 days. Yugoslavia and Greece crushed almost casually. Then suddenly they were losing, retreating, taking casualties that couldn't be replaced. The officers tried to maintain discipline and confidence, but soldiers aren't stupid. They could see what was happening. They could count the empty bunks in their quarters. They could see the frostbite casualties being evacuated, knowing most of those men would never fight again. They could see the supply situation getting worse instead of better. And they started to understand that maybe this war wasn't going to end the way they'd been promised. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. Letters home became more censored. The German military police intercepted and destroyed letters that were too negative, too defeatist. Soldiers learned to write in code, to hint at the truth without saying it outright. They'd write about the weather, and hoped their families understood what that really meant. They'd mentioned that they hadn't received packages in weeks, and hoped their families realized the supply system was collapsing. Some soldiers stopped writing altogether. What was there to say? How do you explain to your wife or mother or girlfriend that you're probably not coming home? That the war you thought would be over by Christmas might last for years? That everything you've been told about inevitable victory is a lie? The Soviet counteroffensive ground forward through December and into January. It wasn't the sweeping encirclements the Germans had executed earlier. Soviet forces didn't have the operational skill for that yet. But they didn't need it. They just pushed. Constant pressure all along the line. German units would hold a position until they were nearly surrounded, then fall back to the next defensible position, then repeat the process. It was exhausting. Soldiers couldn't rest because every rest period was interrupted by another Soviet attack. They couldn't get warm because every building substantial enough to provide real shelter was a target for Soviet artillery. They couldn't eat properly because rations were irregular and inadequate. Combat motivation became a serious issue. Why keep fighting when you're losing? The answer for German soldiers was complex. Some fought because they believed in the cause, in National Socialism and German superiority. Some fought because military discipline was absolute and desertion meant execution. Some fought because they didn't know what else to do, because the military was their life and they couldn't conceive of just giving up. Some fought to protect their comrades, because even if the war was lost, you didn't abandon your buddies. And some fought because they were terrified of what would happen if Soviet forces broke through to Germany. The stories coming out of occupied Soviet territory worked both ways. German soldiers knew what their side had done to Soviet civilians. They could imagine what Soviet soldiers would do to German civilians in revenge. The spring thaw of 1942 brought temporary relief. The Rasputitsa returned, the mud season that made offensive operations nearly impossible. Both sides took the opportunity to rest and refit. German forces were in terrible shape. Divisions that should have had 15,000 men were down to 6,000 or 7,000. Equipment losses were staggering. Tanks that had broken down or been knocked out sat where they'd stopped because there was no way to recover them. Artillery pieces abandoned in the retreat rusted in fields. The Wehrmacht had lost more equipment in 4 months of winter fighting than it had in 2 years of conquest, and replacing it was getting harder because Allied bombing was beginning to affect German industrial production. The Soviet Union was also battered. Their losses in 1941 had been catastrophic. Over 3 million soldiers killed or captured, thousands of tanks and aircraft destroyed, entire industrial regions occupied or destroyed. But Stalin's evacuation of factories to the east was paying off. Production was ramping up. New divisions were forming. The pipeline of reinforcements that had seemed impossible to German intelligence was real and getting larger. The Soviet Union was transitioning from a peacetime economy to a total war economy. Everything subordinated to military production. Consumer goods vanished, living standards plummeted, people starved. But the factories kept running, and the tanks kept rolling off the assembly lines. By summer 1942, Hitler decided to try again. Not a push for Moscow this time. Instead, Operation Blue would drive south toward the Caucasus oil fields. The logic was sound. Germany was desperately short of oil. Soviet oil production in the Caucasus was a strategic prize worth enormous risk. If the Wehrmacht could seize those oil fields, Germany's fuel situation would be solved, and the Soviet Union's would become critical. It was the kind of economic warfare that could actually win the war. The problem was that the Wehrmacht was no longer capable of executing operations at the scale required. The losses from the previous year hadn't been replaced. The new divisions were undertrained and under-equipped. The logistics system was still a mess. Operation Blue started well. German forces broke through Soviet defenses and drove deep into southern Russia. For a few weeks, it looked like maybe Blitzkrieg could work one more time. Then Hitler made a catastrophic decision. He split his forces. Part of Army Group South would continue toward the oil fields. The other part would seize Stalingrad, a major industrial city on the Volga River. The operational justification was thin. Stalingrad had symbolic value because it bore Stalin's name, but limited strategic value. The division of forces meant neither objective would have sufficient strength to guarantee success. German generals objected. Hitler overruled them. The Battle of Stalingrad became the defining disaster of the Eastern Front. German forces entered the city in September 1942. They expected to take it in a few weeks. Instead, they got sucked into brutal urban combat that negated all their advantages. Tanks were useless in city streets where Soviet infantry could approach from multiple directions. Artillery was less effective when targets were buildings instead of open formations. Air superiority meant nothing when combat was happening inside ruined structure. The fighting devolved into room-to-room, floor-to-floor struggles where individual buildings changed hands dozens of times. German soldiers who trained for mobile warfare found themselves fighting World War I-style combat in conditions that made the trenches look pleasant. Soviet defenders turned Stalingrad into a meat grinder. Every building was a fortress, every street a killing zone. They developed tactics specifically designed to neutralize German advantages. Small groups of infantry with anti-tank weapons would let German tanks pass, then attack from behind. Snipers picked off German officers and NCOs, degrading unit cohesion. Soviet artillery on the east bank of the Volga pounded German positions constantly. Reinforcements crossed the river at night, replacing casualties from the day's fighting. The Soviet High Command poured men into Stalingrad knowing most of them would die, but also knowing that every day the Germans spent fighting in the city was a day they weren't advancing toward the oil fields. By November, the German Sixth Army was exhausted. They'd seized most of Stalingrad, but hadn't eliminated Soviet resistance. German soldiers were fighting in ruined buildings amid the onset of another Russian winter. Casualties were enormous. Replacements were inadequate, and then the Soviets sprang the trap. On November 19th, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, two massive pincer movements north and south of Stalingrad, targeting the Romanian armies protecting the German flanks. The Romanians broke almost immediately. Within 4 days, the Soviet pincers met west of Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army, over 200,000 men, was encircled. Hitler ordered them to hold. The Luftwaffe promised to supply them by air, just as they'd supplied encircled forces during the winter fighting the previous year. But Stalingrad was different. The pocket was larger. The supply requirements were greater. Soviet air defenses were stronger. The Luftwaffe couldn't deliver even a fraction of what was needed. German soldiers in the pocket went on starvation rations. Wounded men died from lack of medical supplies. Ammunition ran short. The temperature dropped to -30. Frostbite casualties mounted. And still, Hitler refused to authorize a breakout attempt. Field Marshal Paulus, commanding the Sixth Army, was ordered to hold Stalingrad to the last man. Some German units tried to break out anyway. They were destroyed. Soviet forces tightened the ring methodically, reducing the pocket day by day. German soldiers ate their horses, then they ate leather, then they starved. A relief attempt by Field Marshal Manstein's forces got within 30 miles of the pocket before being stopped by Soviet defenders. That was as close as help got. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was dying. Soldiers were too weak from hunger and cold to fight effectively. Officers executed men for desertion because maintaining discipline was all they had left. The wounded lay in makeshift hospitals with no heat, no medicine, no hope. Paulus surrendered the remnants of the Sixth Army on February 2, 1943. It was the first time an entire German field army had been destroyed. Out of over 200,000 men who'd been encircled, only 90,000 survived to surrender. Most of those died in Soviet prison camps. Fewer than 6,000 ever returned to Germany. The loss was catastrophic militarily and psychologically. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility, already badly damaged outside Moscow, was shattered completely. German civilians heard about the disaster on the radio and understood for the first time that Germany might actually lose the war. The generals who'd trusted Blitzkrieg now faced a terrible reality. They'd lost 2 major campaigns in 2 years. The initiative on the Eastern Front was permanently lost. The best they could hope for was to stabilize the front and somehow negotiate a peace. But with whom? Stalin demanded unconditional surrender. Churchill demanded unconditional surrender. Roosevelt, whose country was now fully mobilized for war, demanded unconditional surrender. There would be no negotiated peace, no way out except through. The only question was, how many more men would die before the inevitable end? German strategy for the rest of the war became purely defensive. Hold as much territory as possible for as long as possible. Extract maximum casualties from the advancing Soviets. Buy time for some miracle that would never come. The Battle of Kursk in summer 1943 was supposed to be an offensive that would regain the initiative. It was the largest tank battle in history. The Germans lost. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht never launched another major offensive in the east. It was all retreat, fighting delaying actions, trying to prevent encirclements, evacuating territory that had cost hundreds of thousands of lives to conquer. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The soldiers understood before the generals did. You could see it in their faces. The confidence of 1941 was gone, replaced by grim determination or quiet desperation or empty numbness. They kept fighting because stopping meant death or captivity, and captivity in Soviet hands was usually just a slower death. They kept fighting because the military machine ground forward and individual soldiers had no control over it. They kept fighting because hope dies hard and maybe, just maybe, something would change. But deep down, most of them knew. They were fighting for a lost cause. Every day survived was a small victory. Getting home alive was the only victory that mattered anymore. The human cost mounted to levels that defy comprehension. Soviet losses on the Eastern Front totaled over 8 million military dead and 17 million civilian dead. German losses were over 4 million military dead. Entire age cohorts of young men were wiped out. Villages that sent dozens of men to war got back 3 or 4. Families lost sons and fathers and brothers. The demographic impact echoed through both societies for generations. The Soviet Union never fully recovered from the population losses. Germany's demographic pyramid was distorted for decades, and the suffering wasn't limited to combat deaths. Wounded soldiers often faced worse fates. German wounded evacuated from the Eastern Front went to hospitals that were increasingly overcrowded and undersupplied. Infection killed men who should have survived their injuries. Amputees faced lives of disability in a society that had no safety net for them. Soviet wounded who survived often ended up in labor camps because Stalin suspected anyone who'd been captured of collaboration. The brutality extended beyond the battlefield into every aspect of life touched by the war. The generals who survived wrote their memoirs after the war. Most blamed Hitler for every decision that went wrong. Some of that was true. Hitler made catastrophic strategic errors. His refusal to allow retreats cost Germany armies it couldn't afford to lose. His racial ideology made total war with the Soviet Union inevitable and unwinnable. But the generals weren't blameless. They'd believed their own propaganda. They'd underestimated the Soviets. They'd trusted that tactical brilliance could overcome strategic stupidity. They'd gone along with criminal orders because winning seemed more important than morality. And when the war turned against them, they kept feeding men into the meat grinder because they couldn't imagine an alternative. The legacy of those decisions is written in blood across Eastern Europe. The generals trusted Blitzkrieg until reality taught them otherwise. By then, it was too late to change course. The machine they'd set in motion couldn't be stopped. Millions died because military professionals made bad assumptions and refused to admit they were wrong until the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. That's the lesson that should haunt every generation of military leaders. That confidence is not the same as competence. That winning battles is not the same as winning wars. That strategic wisdom matters more than tactical brilliance, and that the cost of being wrong is measured in lives that can never be recovered.